Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everybody. I wanted to talk tonight about feelings, emotions. It's something that we talk about a lot around seeking integrity, but there are just some things, and we've all talked about them repeatedly. But I want to point out just some things that you probably have heard before, but some of you might not have. And I just want to talk about just a fresh perspective on feelings. I have 10 bullet points, really quick. The first is that feelings are a form of natural healing, and that when we yawn, when we shake, when we cough, when we cry, especially when we cry, it's a release. It's a physical release. And so feelings express themselves somatically or physically, and it's really important to not stifle them, to let them out. And so we know that that physical expression is not just an emotional component, but it has that somatic or body component that really is an essential part of feelings. So the flip side of that, of course, is that if we don't express feelings, they can be trapped in our body and can make us sick. And there's actually a lot of studies that correspond with different kinds of cancers and heart issues and other kinds of stuff with emotional pain, emotional issues, and unresolved feelings that kind of got buried, and we pay a price for that to keep them there. So expressing them is really a form of natural healing. I think the best example of that is crying. We do it naturally and we feel better. It's a release in a very important way. Yawning, by the way, too, and sometimes when an animal yawns, it's anxiety, they're releasing anxiety. So it's really quite fascinating. The second one, feelings aren't permanent. A lot of the clients we work with just feel, in addiction, by the way, the whole point of addiction is to not feel feelings. And so when they get into sobriety, they start to feel emotions. And one of the big fears is that I'm going to get stuck in this. If I really feel that grief or feel the fear or feel the loneliness, I'll never get out of it. It's going to overwhelm me. And that's kind of, I guess, a natural conclusion if you haven't expressed the feelings before, but it's so important to keep them moving. Feelings are meant to be acknowledged and released. And so the truth is, once we tap into those feelings, even if we haven't been very good at it for years, once we start expressing them, yeah, it's going to be intense, and it's not going to be overwhelming, though, and it may last longer than you think, but you will get through it. And that's actually an essential phase of recovery, is to really move those feelings. We have a backlog of stuff that really is unexpressed, unacknowledged, and has to be kind of aired to keep us on the right track. The third one, and this is probably one everybody's heard, you don't have to justify your feelings. You'll notice that your feelings come up quite naturally. You don't decide to feel lonely or decide to feel sad or determine, yeah, today I'm going to be angry. They happen organically based on situations, our beliefs about ourselves, our interactions with other people. And so sometimes we feel like we have to say, gee, I'm sorry, I'm feeling this way, or I really should be feeling somewhere else, or I never feel. All those kind of words really trap us in the kind of misconception that we somehow have to justify these feelings to their choice, and that they may not belong to us. And in fact, they do. And I think it's really okay. And we talk about that a lot in 12-step program. You don't have to justify your feelings. I think people have often gotten that one. Current feelings may relate to a past situation. So you may have been in a situation one time where you just reacted really strongly, and like strongly out of scale with whatever the situation was, right? Maybe you got really angry, or maybe you got really sad, or maybe lonely, or even happy sometimes. But we can get kind of an extra burst of feeling that doesn't quite make sense given the scale of the situation. And what that's doing, it's tapping into old feelings that we've been carrying around a long time. So if we have other events, and trauma is classic for this. So if I have a traumatic event where I'm feeling very sad and maybe afraid, some other similar situations doesn't have to go anywhere near, doesn't rise near to the scale of the trauma, but it has the same kind of flavor or situation or time of day or smell or light or something that triggers a memory of that earlier trauma event. I'm going to react out of scale. I'm going to react in a way that's fueled by that history that I carry around. So you may find that your feelings, at least initially, are kind of out of sync with the instigating situation. Unacknowledged feelings tend to leak out in destructive behavior. This is really important for addicts to know, because when we have feelings, and oftentimes the ones that addicts love to carry around are, resentments and justified anger and that flavor of stuff, typically more than anything else. But when we sit around and don't express it, when we, for example, express or feel sad that something's happening and we don't talk about it, that can really leak out. Either we can blurt out stuff, it can come out in actually microaggressions in our face, it can come out in passive aggressive ways and indirect ways. So the point here is that we really need to be able to express this stuff and work on it and keep it rolling. That said, you don't have to act on your feelings, right? So feelings, a lot of times we feel that, oh my gosh, I'm getting a strong feeling, I need to do something about it. And very often feelings just need to be experienced and released. So we don't have to really, they don't have to be a driver or the first step in a chain of reaction of actions that we take. We find that when we're in touch with our feelings, we have more choices. And I draw a distinction between responding versus reacting. If I'm reacting to something, it's an automatic, and it's usually based on emotion. If I'm responding, it's informed by emotion, but it includes some thought, careful thought, some consciousness, some mindfulness, and other kinds of aspects that go into this process that allow me to be in touch with my feelings and my choices. And I may not have to do my first impulse to react to that feeling. Seventh one, anger. We talked about this a lot. Anger often masks other feelings. And typically, it's one of those core feelings. So I always ask my clients, if they're feeling angry, drop down underneath it if you can. What's the feeling down there underneath it? And it's usually something much more primal, like hurt or sadness or fear. And the anger is really a defense against feeling those feelings, against being vulnerable to those feelings. So instead of feeling lonely or sad or fearful, I get angry. But at the same time, I'm not really acknowledging the real feeling that I'm feeling. Boredom and restlessness, big problems for sex addicts, intensity addicts. That would include porn and amphetamines as well. But boredom and restlessness may be clues to underlying feelings. So, we're supposed to, I guess, societally, we stay busy, we're rewarded from hard work and all that. However, when we just sit with boredom, we just sit with our restlessness, and this is a skill that I think is really important for every sex and porn addict to practice, because it's very difficult even to set your timer for 3 minutes or 4 minutes and sit there and just experience what's going on. And this is a terrifying prospect to a lot of people, but it's really important because boredom can be a real trigger, and we need to learn how to manage it, how to sit with our feelings if we are unoccupied for 15 minutes or half an hour, instead of having to fill that space with something. And we usually fill it, by the way, with something not good for us. So that's the key there. Unacknowledged feelings can result in physical symptoms. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of studies that talk about how shame and anger and loneliness can really eat away at our cardiovascular system and our digestion and even brain health. And so those feelings are really vitally important to express. And then finally, and this is obvious to anybody that works in seeking integrity or in any treatment centers, but your chances of getting in touch with feelings in a healthy way are more likely in a supportive environment. And so if we're around friends and family and people that deny feelings as well as we do, it's going to be really hard to be vulnerable, to be open, to share our feelings. But we see this all the time in LA with the clients. When the clients come in, all it really takes is one person to be vulnerable, and everybody starts being vulnerable. It's contagious, and it's a good thing. And so we need to surround ourselves with people that are going to support us as we try to feel feelings and express them and get better and better at it. And with that, I think I'll stop. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, David. I've got a couple questions for you, but type some questions into the Q&A. The sooner you get them in, the more likely we are to get to them. So you talked about unexpressed feelings that become trapped in the body. They can have physical manifestations. We get sick. Why do we not express our feelings? Why do so many of us fail to express our feelings?
I think for a lot of us that have that characteristic. Feelings at some point, or a lot of points in our lives in the past, were unwelcome or downright dangerous. There's a lot of times when we grow up in a dysfunctional family of origin, and there's a lot of addicts have a lot of trauma in dysfunctional families of origin. It's pretty common and very common. Sometimes feelings aren't acceptable or welcome or appropriate. You know, in the household I grew up in, feelings were kind of dangerous because my father was a rager and a periodic alcoholic, and in the wrong mood, a feeling of mine could get me in big trouble. So early on, I think I learned to sit on it. Sometimes shame is involved. If I share a feeling at some point and it's shut down, or people make fun of me, or, you know, all those kind of experiences add up. And we very quickly learn how to kind of keep a lid on them. And I think the common element here too with sex and porn addiction is shame, that we carry boatloads of shame. And I think that feeds right into this. Well, if you really know what I was thinking or feeling, you know, you'd laugh at me or make fun of me or walk away. And so we don't say it, and that to our own detriment. But I think that it's that social factor. Also, some of us have these negative core beliefs where we don't feel we have a right to the feeling, that the feeling is going to be wrong, and so on.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I hear guys say, well, I don't know why I'm feeling that, or I shouldn't be feeling that, or I should be feeling. It's like, no, you don't have to justify. It's okay. Tell me what you're feeling. But I think it comes from that same place where we're not allowed to have feelings, or we're not allowed to have certain feelings. So many of us were not allowed to ever be angry, you know, and so anger always feels wrong. Now, this is a question that I don't think you addressed here. To me, feelings are typically, I mean, you did mention feelings are always telling us something. To me, they're telling us about either a met or an unmet need. If I'm joyous, it's probably some need of mine is getting met. And if I'm feeling depressed or lonely or bored or angry, or there's probably some unmet need. Is that how you see this, or am I oversimplifying?
No, I think you're exactly on target. You know, we talk a lot about dependency needs, which are needs that kids have they can't meet for themselves. You know, nurturing and shelter and food, and just that we're dependent on the adults around us to do that. And depending on the messages we get or the consistency that we get our needs met or not, we draw conclusions about ourselves, and we draw conclusions about our rights to have feelings. And oftentimes these are negative core beliefs, you know, that we're somehow unworthy or unlovable or unwanted, and this impacts then our ability to express ourselves or even feel the feelings themselves. I think very often what happens to kids in homes where there's what we call adverse childhood experiences, these challenges, kids don't have very many options to protect themselves. And one of the options they do have is to basically check out, they dissociate. And I think that also sets the stage for addiction early on. But the significant thing about that is that when we dissociate, we disconnect from our emotional life. And so early on, kids are learning how to just shut down the feeling, disconnect from it, as opposed to knowing what it is and expressing it. You know, and you and I know we kind of talk about this all the time, where addicts, when they come in, really don't have a handle on feelings, right? And we have the emojis, we have the feeling wheels, we have all the, because over decades of active addiction, we've gotten out of practice with, we've gotten disconnected from our feelings. We have to reconnect them. We have to relearn. It's like learning how to walk again in many ways.
Yeah, and I popped a link to the feelings wheel into the chat feature for anybody who wants to check that out. I had another question, but it has escaped me, so it couldn't have been that good. Let's jump into the Q&A. How does a CSAT help break through resentment with an addict, particularly when there are resentments that help justify their acting out that may be created to preserve their addiction? I'm a partner who has and still sees this resentment and that he harbors, and it makes our relationship that feel very scary for me. So resentments.
Right. And I can understand your discomfort, because resentments have a way of kind of just spreading toxic energy through a whole relationship. Resentments are really problematic. And I always make a distinction between anger and resentment, because I think anger is a natural and quite healthy emotion. Anger, any emotion, by the way, is like information for us. It's a warning sign. It's a bit of data to help us kind of navigate through the world and with safety. And sometimes anger comes up, and that's a justifiable feeling. What happens when we don't adequately express it and release it and move on is that we get trapped in it. And that anger starts to recycle itself and recirculate with no oxygen coming in. And that is when resentments happen. And resentments have their own kind of addictive potential, I think. When we get into a resentment, especially a justified anger, that's something we can really grab onto as addicts. And we can pretend and tell ourselves that we deserve something, and it just fits right into the perfect rationalization of the addiction and the addiction itself. And so resentments are hugely problematic. They really need to be addressed because they feed this whole denial system. The way I do a couple of things with resentments to try to break through. One is to really, and by the way, this is often best done with peers as opposed to a single therapist, because I think peers often carry more weight, but reflecting back and saying, what is this anger doing? How is it serving you or not serving you? What role do you play in this situation you're so angry about? And ultimately, what good is it doing you? And really the function, I think, a lot of these resentments is to keep us trapped in an unhealthy place. And so I think to really it's a mixed bag to address it. Everything from confronting it to picking apart the inconsistencies in the story to encouraging someone to look at their own role in what they've done. Addicts love to be victims, and just everybody's responsible for our miserable life except us. And so I think to really help them understand that they have a role in this, and if not the primary responsibility for it. So all that said, I think it's really important for your husband to work on this, or your partner to work on this in therapy, for the CSAT to really work with them. And ideally, and I don't know if he's in a group or not, I mean, a therapy group, that's really the workhorse for this kind of stuff, because more than a 12-step group, which is not therapy, but also important, of course, the therapy group is people dive a little deeper and it gets a little more real. And I think the guys can often be a very corrective force there. And Scott, I might be taking a leap on this, but I'm also thinking, because I'm also teaching work groups now, I know you do. And sometimes it's not a group, but sometimes those work groups serve that same purpose, where the guys can kind of self-correct each other if they notice somebody taking on too much resentment or not taking responsibility. So the work group might be a good option. You're muted.
Sometimes in the group setting, someone will start to reinforce the resentment, but inevitably someone else pops up and says, wait, back up, guys. It's really great. The whole group learns from that. It's not just the person with the resentment. The whole group learns from that. That's the power of a group, whether it's a group therapy or an online work group, or just any kind of a support group. It is a group. We're all crazy, but we're not all crazy in the same way at the same time. And we can keep each other on track. Resentments and addiction. Resentments feed addiction. Resentments can be painful and upsetting, and the anger. So it's a good excuse to numb myself with my addiction, alcohol, drugs, sex, porn, whatever. But it can also, and I think you mentioned this when you were answering, it can become a bit of an addiction itself, just like anger can. Yeah. We can use our resentments as a form of escape. I used to pull out my old resentments and I was like Gollum with the ring, I'd be like, my precious. And I'd play with these 30, 40-year-old resentments to get out of my head. Whatever I didn't want to deal with in a moment, I would use these old resentments, and yuck. I mean, it didn't make me feel any better, but it at least got me out of my head from the present distress, but it just took me into all other distress. But an addict, sometimes we just want to get out of our present distress. There's a saying in AA, I know, David, you've heard this, carrying resentments is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And that really is that when I would take out my resentments and play with them, it was like I was drinking poison. I was poisoning my own soul. The only thing I'll add to the work is, I was always told, whoever you've got the resentment against, pray for them to have all the wonderful things you would want in your life. Do that morning and evening for 30 days. And I've done that. I spent an entire year getting rid of all my resentments from middle school and high school. It took me an entire year to get rid of all of them. And every time I take on a new one, I would spend the first 10 days of praying, having resentment about the fact that I had to pray for these people that I didn't like. But by the end, the resentments had lost their power. It does take work. It does take effort, because resentments are oftentimes old and deeply rooted. It's hard to let go of them, and we don't want to let go of them. It's a comfort zone. Even though it's unpleasant, it's still a comfort zone.
Right. And I just want to underscore that we get a lot of adrenaline, and there's a rush that goes with resentment, and especially justified anger, right? Because it's like, man, I've been wronged, and it's kind of very fueling and invigorating in an unhealthy way. And I think to the intensity addict, like a sex or porn addict, that's a familiar feeling, and that rush is very seductive itself. And so, but boy, dangerous, slippery slope territory to be messing around with that.
Yeah, and I'll just throw out one more AA saying: anger, even justifiable anger, will get us drunk. And the same is true for sex addiction. It's just let other people be angry. Let's clean up our side of the street and let it go.
Right.
But it's hard. Okay, next one here. My husband and I are struggling so much, feeling connected after a recent minor discovery of him struggling with objectification and looking at women in public. He was being advised by his SA group that it wasn't acting out and that I didn't need to know. Luckily, our CSAT came in and helped him make changes and corrections. He's ready to continue forward and learned a lot from this, and is recommitted and enthusiastic about his plan. We were feeling so close and on a whole new level of growth before this came out recently. Now things feel so thrown back, trust is broken again, and it's leaving us both feeling so disconnected. Any tips? He wants to get back where we were, and so do I, but we have no idea how. I'm grateful that the acting out wasn't nearly as bad as it used to be, but it was still very painful. I would love any tips you have. Let me ask you this question. So addicts often want to know, I caught myself at the grocery store objectifying, somebody in line in front of me. Do I have to tell my wife that or not? Is that a form of acting out or not? Do you have thoughts on that, David?
Well, I know that a lot of sex addicts like to think that acting out is something they do with another person or with a computer and monitor, but what goes on when they're out in public, in their heads, in their attention and their fantasy is kind of not counting toward anything. And I the longer I've been in this work, the greater and more expansive my notion of slippery slopes and trouble. And I think this is a real problem in terms of behavior that, it's not as bad as acting out per se, but we can read the effect it's have on the trust and the sort of slow safety that's been built up, right? So there's a lot of backsliding in there. So I think the behavior itself is problematic. Now, it gets a little tricky at that point in terms of how much to get back and say for kind of just the reason we're reading here, and that if every event is processed with the spouse, I think it can seem overwhelming sometimes. What I recommend is that every event must be processed with a sponsor and a peer group, and then go back to the spouse and say, this is what happened. I think the spouse needs to know something's going on. I don't think the details are necessarily that important, except we need to be honest, we can't misrepresent. But I think most guys want to put this kind of where their eye wanders into some kind of different category, that's some kind of safe zone from their recovery. And I think that that's a problem. But I don't know, Scott, what do you think about conveying that information to the spouse?
You know, this is always a legitimate question. And my first question is, does she want to know everything, or does he want to know, you know, does your partner want to know everything? A lot of the times they don't want to know every little thing that goes on in your head. If your partner does want to know everything, you kind of have to say, you know, you probably need a check-in at the end of every day to say, yeah, you know, I got triggered at the grocery store and here and here. And this is what I did when I was triggered, which is a key element of this. I used the 3-second rule. I called my sponsor. I did this, I did that. You know, that's always the more important thing to say than I got triggered at the grocery store. The more important thing is, and here's what I did to get untriggered. You know, I use this tool, and this tool. Usually the wife appreciates, okay, you know, there was somebody, you know, in yoga pants or whatever in front of you, you know. Now guys will also ask this question, you know, if I just have something going on in my head, is that a red circle behavior, as in a bottom line acting out behavior, or is it yellow circle, which means a slippery behavior? And my response is, we can't control the thoughts that pop into our head. I mean, the world is full of visuals. TV, walking down the street, going to the ball game, you're going to see attractive people, or people who are attractive to you. You're going to catch yourself having a sexual thought every once in a while. The question is, once you catch yourself having a sexual thought, once you catch yourself objectifying someone, to use the language from this question, which is also the language we use in treatment, what do you do with it? Do you work to get rid of it? Do you use the tools of recovery, or do you make a movie out of it? If you're making a movie out of it, to me, that is a conscious choice. I realize I'm having a sexual thought and I can use my tools of recovery, or I can create porn in my head and maybe even masturbate to it later. That's acting out for me. You know, in my plan, that's acting out. I'm not allowed to make a movie out of objectification. So I'm kind of extending the question a little bit, but do you have thoughts on that, David?
No, I think I agree with you totally. I think I liken it to a dream. You know, when we're dreaming at night, stuff filters up out of our subconscious. We're not responsible for controlling the content of our dreams. It's beyond our control. Just like those fantasies will come up, not fantasy, I'm sorry, the triggering when we get attracted to someone. But at that point, do we, like you say, make a movie out of it? Do we engage with it, or do we let it go? And I think it's incumbent on us to be able to let it go, because otherwise we're just going down that slippery slope, and nothing good happens from that, for sure.
Yeah,
So
I love teaching like my porn work groups, because those guys are porn addicts like I am. And, you know, I'm constantly telling them, we don't have to see porn to see porn. You know, we have to watch what's going on in our heads with the objectification. We can't control getting triggered. We can control what we do with it. And that's the important thing. And if your wife wants to know, yeah, I got triggered 3 times today, but here's what he did about it.
Right. And I would, you know, we kind of talked around it, but I just want to mention explicitly the idea of not porn here, because I think that's another place where guys really think they can play a little loose and look at things like Facebook or TikTok in a very sexual way. And certainly there's a lot of sexual content. Is it explicit porn? No, but man, is it suggestive? Yes. And so a lot of guys find themselves just kind of in their, you know, recovery, air quotes, moving into that stuff, but they're still doing the fantasy. They're still getting the dopamine drip in their brain, but it's just stuff that's not explicit porn. So we have to be really clear and exact about what we put in front of our eyeballs, frankly, because our fantasy can run with it.
If you're cruising Instagram or TikTok or YouTube looking for, you know, clothed but sexy pictures, you're in the bubble of the addiction. You
Right.
have neurochemically escaped the real world, which is, you might as well have drunk a 12 pack. I mean, you're just out there. Um, and it's not good for any recovering sex or porn addict to be there.
Right.
So yeah, have to watch for not porn. How can I help my wife with the fear of leaning in and trying to build, and then I act out again? I'm in therapy and recovery groups. I understand my triggers and know in my heart that I will never cause either of us this kind of pain again. I understand the self-work needs to continue far past reconciliation and transparency. Honesty is the key. I can't tell if he's still acting out or not. I'm gonna say he's not acting out, but his wife is still struggling to lean in and trust.
Right. Right. And this is one of the classic dynamics in recovery, especially early recovery, because traumatized spouses, betrayed spouses are looking for reassurance and safety. And it's slow to come. And even though, like this guy says, I know I will never do it, and know in my heart, we can't guarantee that, unfortunately. We have the intention of that. And I think that's the nagging worry that every spouse has, is like, what if or when? And I would just remind people that people do recover from this addiction for a long time. And so it's not inevitable. But I think it can be a bumpy road. And so I understand the concern. I think I found just the best thing to do here is just good communication and honesty and intent. And if you can, kind of the model we proposed a few minutes ago, if you're having trouble, deal with it. What did you do about it? And then report back kind of how you processed it. I think just that transparent glimpse into how you're dealing with this can be reassuring. It may not, your wife may not be happy that you might have been triggered by somebody at the grocery store in yoga pants, but hopefully it'll be somewhat reassuring that this is what you did about it, A, B, C, D, and now you're reporting back.
Right.
And so I think that's the key here. That said, this takes a long, long time. A lot of spouses don't want to be totally trusting and vulnerable until they have a disclosure and really know what's on the table. And I totally get that. So the process takes a long time. Also, by the way, it depends on what we bring, our personal histories that we bring to it. Very often spouses have their own history long before this current relationship of abuse or betrayal or other kinds of issues that impact how they're reacting to this situation. And so it's a long and complex situation. Though all that said, want to make sure I want to put in some hope here, because things do get better. I do the alumni meetings twice a month, and we see guys now that have been sober through Seek Integrity almost 4 years, and they're on there, and I'm seeing and hearing relationships getting better and the trust being, coming back. And in fairness, some relationships didn't make it, right? But at least in our alumni groups, and these are the guys that are working at and actively connected to us still, there's a lot of success. And so I can just point out to that when you're in the moment, it may not feel like it, but that, you can trust again. But I think the transparency of the process is what really does help to kind of bring people closer again together. Any tips from your point of view, Scott, on that?
I don't know about tips, but I'll sort of parrot what Dr. Rob says about this is betrayed spouses are on an emotional roller coaster, just like the addicts. And unfortunately, it's not the same roller coaster. So, sometimes one party's up and the other one's not, and the other one's down. Sometimes you're both up at the same time, or we're riding that roller coaster. Betrayed partners in particular are riding that roller coaster usually for a good year. They want to trust you, but they can't. They want to be comfortable with you, but they're not. And it's a year if you do everything right. If you're working your program, if you're rigorously honest, and it's not so much whether you perfectly stay sober, it's whether you're perfectly rigorously honest, if that makes sense. Tell the truth and tell it faster. That will help the relationship more than good sobriety, but not always good honesty. Where were you after work? Oh, you know, if you say, instead of just, that's a problem. So rigorous honesty, I guess that's my tip. Be rigorously honest, tell the truth, tell it faster, tell the whole truth, not just the parts that you think she'll be okay hearing. Don't make her ask questions. When she does ask questions, answer the question, and then everything else that goes with the question. Don't just answer the question and stop. Answer all of it. Tell her everything. You know, eventually she'll come around, but yeah, it's going to take a year, give or take.
And I just want to throw in, putting my therapist hat on here. It's more than just working a program of recovery. Well, that's certainly essential, but it's also really making effort at other areas like communication skills, empathy, compassion, sharing feelings, of the topic we were talking about tonight, learning how to feel feelings and express them. That kind of stuff is really, really important and essential, really, to healing the relationship. We can't just kind of take the sex addiction off the table and hope the relationship moves forward smoothly, because there was a lot of dysfunction, at least on the part of the addict before, right? I teach an intimacy skills workshop, and these are all kind of new to everybody, and in terms of how to feel compassion and empathy, and how to break down feelings, and how to communicate effectively, and so on. So that kind of internal work also needs to be an important element in moving this forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this next question. The function of resentment is to keep us trapped. Why do we want to be trapped?
You know, earlier tonight, I think Scott mentioned, or one of us mentioned, that in our uncomfortable feelings, in our discomfort, there's a certain comfort. They're kind of familiar and a little uncomfortably cozy. But more, I think, that keeps us trapped is that this is the devil that we know, but there's this other world out there that I think, at least when I was active in my addiction, I didn't want to take a chance on finding out what that might be. I knew this one trapped in my addiction, but I wasn't sure what was on the other side. And so it was fear of change, of what was going to happen, of what would become of me, of who am I without the addiction? Who am I without these character defects? Who am I without these negative core beliefs? All of that stuff, all the personal baggage that we bring in is what keeps us trapped. And I think it's what fueled the addiction in the first place. All that stuff that was so uncomfortable, we just kind of started to self-medicate and not feel it. But we see this over and over again in every situation, even outside of addiction, with people feeling trapped and basically recreating the same situation, even though they may change their circumstances to feel open again. I remember in graduate school, a really fast story. I was working at a family service agency and as an internship, and this woman was with her 3 kids in a very small studio apartment, trapped and really uncomfortable, not even healthy. So we worked very hard to get her a big 2-bedroom apartment that was subsidized, that she could afford. And it was a success story from our point of view. We went back to do a site visit a couple months later. She and her children were living in one room in the 2-bedroom apartment. She had just recreated that because she didn't really have the skills or the understanding of what it was that was keeping her locked up like that. And so it's not just a matter of changing the circumstances. I think we have to do the internal work to help us move past it.
Yeah. I'll just add, resentments for me, I actually got something from them. It was my one chance to be self-righteous and angry. You know, as a child, I was never allowed to have those feelings. I was never allowed to have strong feelings of any kind. So in my little resentment, my little bubble of resentment, I could have strong feelings without anybody judging me. Because resentment's a very private thing. You know, I wasn't sharing them with the world. So I got something out of my resentments, which was a chance to feel, which was something I wasn't allowed to do as a kid. So
that's a great therapeutic lead-in question too. Is like, well, how is this serving you? You know, being trapped. You know, how's that functioning? What is it doing for you? Because there's always a payoff of some kind. It may not seem like it, but that's a very useful question.
Yeah. Why are you living in one room? What are you getting out of that? You know, there's a reason for it.
Right.
Who knows? it may be a crazy reason that we don't like to use the word crazy, but a reason that's completely dysfunctional, but there's a reason.
Right.
What about feelings based on cognitive distortions? Great question. My sex addict husband tends to interpret things in a negative way and then become resentful, hurt, angry, frustrated, or defensive. Or he's so used to ignoring feelings that the only feelings he's even fully aware of,
Not even fully aware of.
not even fully aware of what he's actually feeling. I have to work with him to get through both cognitive distortions and to get in touch with his feelings. And most of the time it's frustrating for both of us. So feelings based on cognitive distortions and also just feelings that are not felt.
Right. So first of all, a cognitive distortion is a thinking error that basically where we have these filters in our brain that we see the world through. And so the situation can be out there and we can, if we're a black and white thinker, we can give ourselves, well, I have this option or that option and nothing else. We can kind of paint ourselves into a corner of feeling trapped. Cognitive distortions can include rationalizing, minimizing, catastrophizing. Everything is like the world's greatest disaster. It can be things that circulate around should and always and never. In other words, all this stuff in our brain that helps us distort reality in usually a negative way, like this writer says. And so that negativity thing is a really strong one. It's addicts over time do develop this kind of, we call it a negativity bias. The glass is always half full. And so that is something that these cognitive distortions really do feed. It's a relatively simple fix in that once someone understands their own like pet favorite cognitive distortions, they can really become aware of them and start to change. It's a habit. And so those habits can be changed, and it makes a huge difference because people don't often realize how often they're saying, I always do this, or I never do that, or everything's a disaster, or nothing really matters, or all these distortions that we have, rationalizing. So I think really learning to identify the cognitive distortions, and I have pretty good success with clients pointing them out, and then maybe pointing them out a couple more times, and after that, the client has them, and they hear themselves when they're doing it, and that's very corrective and it's very quick. So now that said, cognitive distortions, when they're not corrected, can lead to all kinds of feelings. That's the whole basis of cognitive behavioral therapy, is that our thoughts control our feelings and result in certain feelings depending on that thought. And so really the thoughts are critical. So if we are overly negative, those negative core beliefs I referred to earlier, that a lot of addicts have, a lot of the human race has, I'm not enough, I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy, I'm unsafe, all that stuff that we learn, we soak up in our families of origin, that continues to guide our behavior as adults. And so really to get through all that and to deal with those feelings is critically important, for sure. In terms of feelings unexpressed, there was a question earlier about being trapped and not moving on. I think with addiction, there's a kind of an inertia. It's very heavy and feels like 1,000 pounds to try to move. And I think we get stuck in our ways and we get stubborn. And I think the more of our life that gets chipped away and, as a consequence of the addiction, the more stubborn we get sometimes, hanging on to, whatever we have left. And so that kind of attitude really does need to change, and it can change through therapy and program and so on. But the feelings in that process, hopefully, the feelings that aren't being expressed will start to have a place. Remember one of those bullet points I said, you're more likely to feel feelings if you're in a supportive environment. And I think that's being in a 12-step group, or being in a therapy situation, or being in a men's group, or whatever. Those are all scenarios where you can really, or having just a group of guys. Fellowship, I think, is really important after a meeting, and just to go out with coffee or a meal after people, and that too is incredibly productive and healthy, I think, to correct some of these things, because you're getting, each one of those people you're out with is a mirror back to you, and hopefully they have some wisdom they can share with you, or point things out that they might have experienced themselves. So there is movement, but it has to be a willingness to move on the part of the addict.
Yeah. And David mentioned earlier, there's so much more to recovery than just sobriety. I mean, we can stop the behavior, and that's great, but there's so much more to this. And for an addict, cognitive distortions come from our shame. Shame drives us to have these negative core beliefs. So if we identify our shame and where it comes from and debunk the shame and work through that, while at the same time working on our negative core beliefs, then it's easier to have our feelings and it's easier to be vulnerable. It's a big, long continuum of identifying the sources of our problems and the lies that we tell ourselves about being not good enough, about being not worthy of, I'm not allowed to have feelings. I was literally told as a child, I'm not allowed to have feelings. Boys don't have feelings, let alone express them. I had to work through all of this, and I'm still working through it. Those core beliefs are still there. I just have to tell them to shut up sometime because I know they're not true now. But boy, they still chatter at me.
Right. So true.
And
I'll just say, as an expectation for recovery, I think a lot of times people expect those core beliefs will totally disappear and be replaced by some new shiny set of positive core beliefs. And we certainly can get new positive ones, but like you, the old ones kind of are there, but kind of dead, but I still go there first. And then
that's the first thing I hear is the negative core belief. And I'm like, stop it. And, then I come in to the work of recovery and recognize, I am a worthwhile person. It's okay for me to be me. It's okay, whatever it is that I need to hear at that point. And I get good at telling myself. I don't have to rely on a partner or somebody else to do it. I can pretty much do it myself now. Right. Okay. Let's see. And learning about my sex addict partner's behavior, I've recently realized my mom has been a dry drunk most of my life. I'm sorry to hear that. She has very manipulative behavior and has bouts with alcoholism and eating disorders. She will not openly admit to any of this or most of it. My parents have been married, excuse me, for over 40 years, and my dad has endless patience with her. Is this why I gravitate toward unhealthy partners? I've been with 2 alcoholics and a sex addict as my 3 most significant relationship. There's a lot packed into that.
Yeah. There is a kind of couples therapy called imago therapy that a guy named Harville Hendricks created, known most for their imago dialogue, great couples communication exercise. But it relates to this in that Harville Hendricks felt that the people we ultimately choose as partners in our adult lives are a blend of factors, of significant people in our childhood, both good and bad factors. And so, and that kind of fits in this case if your mother has been on a drug most of her life and so on. We learn how to relate as kids to people who are basically living with dysfunction. And that may be as a caretaker, it may be as we get resentments and we get kind of a bond of resentment at them. It may be some other need, but we get locked into these kind of relationship dynamics, and we learn what relationships are like based on that, and we carry that forward. And so when fast forward 20 years, we're getting married, we have a life partner, and they're often very similar to parents, and often the parents that we said we wanted to be nothing like, we often turn out to like them ourselves as well. So I think we have it kind of in us. And until we actively move to understand what those dynamics are, because a lot of attraction, a lot of connection is not always conscious. There's a lot of unconscious dynamics that pull us toward people. Seeing somebody across a crowded room, not cliche, there's a lot to that in terms of unresolved psychological issues and attractions and things like that. So it's not surprising to me that you would find these problems kind of carry forward into your partner selection. That said, you're not doomed to this future, right? You can take this pattern, and this is great fodder for therapy right here. You can take the pattern and really work to change it and see. And it may be that it's unrelated. I suspect it probably is related, as you've observed. But what is it? What is it about those people? What is that doing for you? You know, some of those questions we asked before. And I think to really look at it. And so, you know, I don't know if you're still in a relationship, I guess you are. But anyway, we can shed some light on those dynamics that seem to mysteriously pull us towards someone or push us away from somebody else, and really start to change those. You don't have to repeat that dynamic for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and I just want to, just from the prodependence perspective, which we talk about a lot, there's nothing wrong with you that you're picking people who have problems. You may like helping people. You may like a little drama in your life. You know, you may get some things that are positive for you out of relationships like this. But you also probably don't want somebody who's more interested in a bottle or a porn image than you. So, you know, now that you're aware of this, it's time to set some healthy boundaries. It's time, you know, but don't let anybody tell you there's something wrong with you just because you're picking people who have problems. You're a loving person, and it's okay to love somebody. And some of us like to be helpers, and you may really enjoy being a helper. But there are ways that, you know, to help an addict or an alcoholic that are more useful than others. And that's where prodependence therapy comes in. It's like, here are some boundaries, here are some techniques that you can use that are going to be more effective, things like that. But we don't like the term codependent because it sort of blames you and shames you for constantly picking the wrong partner. Well, who says these guys are the wrong partner? Maybe they're really nice. I don't know, just with the problem. So yeah, any thoughts on that, David?
No, I totally agree. I think it's easy to do, you know, to kind of blame somebody or feel somehow I'm wrong. You know, I'm reminded of Gary Chapman's book on the 5 love languages. We have different ways of expressing our care for someone. Now, there's some dysfunction in this scenario that we're reading now, but people have different ways of expressing it, and that may be that, you know, I get involved with people who have certain kinds of issues because I might be really good at it. If I was a caretaker for, you know, an alcoholic parent, maybe I have those skills. Is that what I want to be doing this life? Maybe, or maybe not. But I'll tell you how this plays out, and it's in terms of not blaming people at all. Most of us, and myself included, grew up in an alcoholic household, a dysfunctional household with addiction active in it. And so I got really good at learning how to read the room, if you will, how to sense the feelings, how to see, you know, what mood is dad in today. And all those skills are directly transferable. I think they're part of what make me a good therapist. They're good observational skills. I mean, all these things can be kind of put to good use. It doesn't mean that we're doomed somehow, but it's all life experience that kind of delivers us to the spot where we're at today. But I don't think it also means that we have to stay there the rest of our lives if we want to change.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I don't know if we have time to answer this one, but let's try. How do I come to terms with the fact that I don't need all the details on what the women my husband objectified looked like? Let's just stop with that. How do I come to terms with the fact that I don't need all the details on what the women my husband objectified look like? And this is a woman who seems to feel like she should want all those details. Is it okay for her to be in the dark about that?
You know, I think one of probably the hallmark of the impact of sex addiction betrayal on partners is this just lack of trust and sense of safety. And the person they share their life with is, who is this person? You know, all these years and didn't know, and all these secrets, and the betrayal that goes with that is quite devastating. And I think one of the strategies that partners resort to is information seeking, you know, becoming a detective of whatever you want to talk about it, where going through credit card receipts and gas slips and pockets, and all in it, not because they're necessarily snoopy, but because they want to find out what's the situation here, how bad is it, trying to get to the bottom of it. And so I think there's a strategy of information, wanting to know everything, but ultimately what I found in my own clinical experience is that there's never enough information. That you can have all the information in the world, but your mind is going to say, well, what if there's something more? And that's the anxiety, and that's the lack of safety. And so I don't think necessarily that getting all the information is going to resolve that, because unfortunately, the way that our minds are wired, there's always that doubt. It's like, well, maybe there's something else out there that I don't know yet. And so the strategy is a little bit flawed, I think, trying to get information. Now, the other thing I know that people can do is really upset themselves and kind of stay in that pain. And I think that's a really, it's almost a reflex to know more, want more, and not be able to figure out how to escape the pain without just knowing all the information. And I think there is a lot to be said, as we discussed earlier tonight, about the process. And I think ultimately, in my experience clinically, having a couple talk about what just happened, including the process of what steps did I take as an addict to bring myself back on track, that's much more helpful than knowing all the details. Because the other thing we found is that sometimes these details get right in people's heads, and they're really, really hard to get out. And so you want to think very carefully about what you want in your head swimming around. You want honesty, you want the truth, but I think we can describe that in ways that may not do harm, and that's the thing we're trying to balance. Giving you the information you need, the safety you need, but not doing harm to you at the same time.
Yeah. And the one thing I'll add here, and I'm going to save the rest of this question for next week because there's a lot more in it. Sex addiction is not about the sex. It's about emotional escape. I'll talk to guys, and they've slept with prostitutes, they've done this, they've done that. And I'll be like, were any of those women as attractive as your wife? No, not really. Was the sex better than it is with your wife? Oh, no. Was she more interesting? No. Smarter? No. Funnier? No. Anything better than your wife? No. Why'd you have sex with her? Because I needed to escape. It was my coping mechanism. I needed to get out of my head, and the adrenaline that comes with this and the dopamine that comes with this got me out of my emotional distress. We talked about how difficult it is for us to feel. I was having a feeling and it was uncomfortable. So I turned to porn or an affair or some fantasy. It's not about having the sex. It's not about what the person I'm being sexual with or staring at. It's not about what they look like. It's about me getting out of my head. That's always kind of tough for betrayed partners to wrap their heads around. Well, she must have been better looking than me. Well, probably not. She must have been more attractive than me. No, probably not. The sex must have been better than me. Nope, probably not. In reality, but it's a tough thing to wrap your head. Then why did you do it? And in truth, it's got nothing to do with the betrayed partner. I don't drink because my betrayed partner is unattractive. I drink because I want to get out of my head. Sex addiction is the same way. It's not any kind of a judgment on you. It's a judgment on what's going on in my head that I don't want to feel. Okay. I'm going to save the rest of this question. Plus, there's a couple more after this for next week, because I want to do the rest of that question justice, plus everything else that's come up. So I'm saving those. Come back next Wednesday. We will address the remaining questions. David, anything you would like to say to take us out?
No, just great group tonight. And I think just it comes down to feelings, doesn't it? Moving them and processing them, feeling them. And that's the key. That's the core.
Yeah. Great topic, great questions. We'll see you next week. David, thank you as always.
Thanks, Scott. Talk to you. Bye-bye.